Hey, good morning, everyone. Let me just bring up the slide quickly. Okay, there we go. Morning, hi, everyone. See the numbers coming in. Fantastic. Thanks for joining us all today. And welcome to another HR and Data Network webinar. My name's Nick Smith. I'm the sales manager at CHRO South Africa. While people are joining, please just in the chat, say hi, let us know where you're from, who you are, but please make sure to address all your comments to everyone in the chat box, and not just the panelists. To do that, at least everyone else can sort of see what's going on, see what you guys are thinking. Yeah, please get involved, post any questions, comments you have in the chat. If there's any direct questions to the panelists, just put them there. We've got quite a lot to get through today. So at the end, we will tackle those questions. We'll get through as many of them as possible. If we do run out of time, your questions will be answered after the fact. So please, yeah, just get involved. I'll give it 1 more minute. I see people are still coming in. So for all the new people, again, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Really going to be a great session, some great insights, and hopefully some fantastic learnings that you can all sort of take home with you. Okay, cool. I think let's get started. So webinar today is all about solving succession, planning for leadership evolution in uncertain times, and is brought to you today by us, CHRO South Africa, and our amazing partner, HFMtalentindex. Now, 93% of companies feel that succession planning is important for business success, yet only 35% have a succession plan in place. Today, talent management leaders will share their learnings on succession planning while providing practical advice on how to get started and improve existing processes. We will have a discussion with our panelists who will reflect on their leadership experiences at their various organizations and share their insights on how other organizations are handling succession planning. If there is a perfect way to approach succession, where do we start? What are the most important puzzle pieces to consider? And what practical pieces of advice can you implement easily? We will then explore the outcomes of the 2021 State of Succession Survey and provide practical advice on the most important elements to consider in a succession journey, and unpack best practices that can be easily implemented to solve the challenge of succession planning in the digital workplace. So our panel today, we have Nomaswazi Ngwane, the Human Capital Executive for Mass and Foundation Cluster at Old Mutual. We have Graham Ferson, a leadership coach and founder at Novo. Caitlin Quibell, Senior Psychologist at HFMtalentindex, and Linda Roos, the Group Head of Human Capital at Uber. So before we start off, I just want to put up a quick poll to get things going. So if you guys can just please take just a few moments to get that answered. You should see that up now. What is your organization on where is your organization on its succession planning journey? We have a well-designed approach that supports our business strategy. We have a process in place, but needs improvement. We do it reactively when the need arises. We don't do it, but we need to start. And we do see the need for it currently. Cool, I see some nice responses coming through. Thanks for that, everyone. I'll just give it 1 or 2 more moments. People still busy answering, having a think about it. Cool. Seems that the majority currently seem to have something in place, but does need improvement. So hopefully today, after the session with the panelists, you'll be able to improve that a little bit. Cool. I'm going to end it now, and let's have a look. Share results. Okay, so we have 7% currently have a well-designed approach, 41%, and the clear majority here. So we have a process in place that needs to improve. Split between 25%. We do it reactively when needed, and we don't do it but we need to start. So hopefully you lot will get some good information today, and only 2% say they don't see the need for it currently. Cool, so thanks for that. So I'd like to just ask the panelists to please come on camera and let's get the discussion underway. So first up, Graham, I want to start with you. How do you define succession planning?
Yeah, it's a tough question, Nick. So thanks for opening with me. And I did say you could throw these difficult questions at me. Definitions matter. Hello, everybody. I think for me, my experience of working as a coach, either as part of a succession plan or when a post-succession plan hasn't quite worked out, is that it's a long-term discipline. It's something that organizations put in place and have in place as a discipline. And it combines both data-centric and human-centric approaches that create greater talent certainty on one hand, but also greater organizational agility on the other hand. So it's long-term, it's a discipline inside the organization, which means it's clear whose responsibility it is, and it's a combination of data and human-centric approaches that give talent certainty and organizational agility.
Mute button. Thanks, Graham. Caitlin, from HFM's perspective, going to add anything on to sort of your definition and how you see succession planning?
Thanks, Nick. Good morning, everyone. Glad to be here. So, like Graham says, we definitely look at succession planning as a long-term perspective on talent. And for us, it's about looking at three simple questions. Where is our talent right now? Where do we want them to go in future? And how do we get them there? And basically bringing all those elements together into a semi-structured process that can then be implemented and repeated.
Awesome, cool, thanks, Caitlin. So now we know what it is all about. I want to move to you, Swazi. From your perspective, how important is succession planning and why?
So I found it interesting that 2%, I think it was saying that that maybe it's not a need or not started yet. I think the one thing I want to identify from Graham's definition around the organization being able to be agile. Take the past 18 months, the number of changes that we've had, the shifts businesses have had to make, whether it was in the form of loss of employees, change in operating model, people making different life decisions because of a pandemic, which just happens to be an incident at this point in time, but it's our reality. And if you think about the sustainability of our businesses and the continuous, call it running of business units as well as organizations, it becomes critical that you have a plan around that and what position the organization takes in terms of talent when you are in those times of need. But it's important that you also don't think about it in terms of times of need. From an employee value proposition perspective, the world has changed so much. Research is telling us that the number of employees that are about to retire versus those that are starting employment is much higher. You have less people choosing formal employment and wanting to do so many different things. You have millennials wanting to work cross-functionally, cross-industry, try be in a gig economy. And for organizations that are set up as traditional corporates and traditional organizations, those structures are not ready for that. And I think part of the conversation today, I hope, will give the why you must start in that context. From an EVP perspective, employees are evaluating, if I go to company X or if I go to company B, what does my development plan look like? What does my path look like? And is it stagnant? Is it a path where I can move across industry, across discipline? And it's important that organizations respond to that because we are competitive. We're competitive with each other, we're competitive in the market, and we're competitive globally. Things like talent sharing has started to happen across the world, cross-industry moves of talent. And I think as a country, probably something we need to start and move along with. I think just from an importance perspective, if you reflect on the need for having, and when you think about the definition, it talks to transition of leadership as well as critical jobs. In the absence of those critical jobs, in the absence of leadership in organizations, you then, from a sustainability perspective and a continuity of business perspective, put yourself at a massive risk if you don't start to plan for talent today.
Well, thank you, Swazi. Linda, if you can sort of just add on, obviously, to what Swazi said, but also, your own sort of opinion on the value of succession planning to, one, the company, to the individual, and sort of lastly, just industry in general.
So I think Swazi's really covered it well from an individual perspective. People are expecting to have opportunities to grow and evolve and develop in an organization. From a company perspective, succession planning is really, it's a risk mitigation strategy in order to ensure that your business remains profitable and sustainable, that it maintains the kinds of relationships it needs. So in our business, two very, very important areas for us that are driving our succession planning agenda are the relationships that our people hold that need to be maintained and nurtured, and then very scarce, very critical niche skills that we have to retain in the business that you run the risk of having eroded and leaving, obviously, if they aren't passed on internally. So we see succession planning as it's a term that we've borrowed from someone else, but really as bench strength. So if you think of a sports analogy, there are some roles or in a sports team that, and I think the person I was listening to recently made the example of a soccer team. So if you don't have a goalie, it's game over. And those are the mission critical types of roles that need to be identified in your business. And mission critical roles are the ones that if you can't fill them quickly, there are significant ramifications for your business in terms of productivity and reputation and relationships and that sort of thing.
Awesome, thanks, Linda. And Graham, I'll come to you shortly on the risk side of things. But Caitlin, just on the value of succession planning, from your perspective, what do you see?
So maybe we could look at it from the perspective of the industry. I think, beyond, from an organizational perspective, beyond the benefit to the organization and beyond the benefit to the individual, optimizing talent, developing technical skills, developing soft skills, all of those also help to, move forward the industry as a whole that the organization is working in. And, basically helping to bring innovation, for example. And I think the reality is as well, and something that maybe organizations don't think about, is there is definitely going to be some cross-pollination of talent within the industry. In other words, you're going to lose some of your talent and they're going to go to other people in the industry, but other talent is also going to join your organization. And so I also think there's the perspective of how do we develop individuals not only for our benefit, but for the benefit of the industry as a whole.
Oh, thank you. Graham, you and I have walked a bit of a road together. You were my first boss at CHRO-SA. I believe you went through a successful succession planning with our current boss. And sort of in the current work you're doing, you talk a lot about this whole concept of what succession planning is. And I know some of the leaders that you talk to, this is some of the discussions you have. But from what you've seen and what sort of you discuss, what are the risks of ineffective succession planning?
Thanks for the gentle compliment, Nick. I want to touch, I think Linda touched on this idea of it being a risk mitigation exercise. And my experience working as an executive coach with leaders in transition is that when it's well executed and well planned, leaders then have a plan in terms of how to take up their new roles. People understand how those roles will be integrated or what they're going to do. And if it's not done well, and I would suggest that's the majority of clients that I work with, I often get a call from the executive or from the HR executive that says we have a new leader taking occupation of the seat soon, or where I've taken occupation and I'm feeling a little spun out. I don't have a clear plan. I'm not sure how to get from A to B in this transition. And the risk is that I think your organization potentially loses direction. Often in that early stage, executives drown themselves in trying to take up the seat without a clear plan. And I see a lot of burned out executives. So there are two parts. There's organizational risk and there's individual risk. I think that the challenge to get it right and get your succession planning right, and Swazi touched on this, which I think is critical, is that succession planning isn't just risk mitigation, but also an opportunity to do some future and forward-looking or scenario planning. Nobody could have anticipated what we've gone through now. But if you want to have an organization that is agile and able to adjust to the circumstances, that also gives you the opportunity to think about what talent would help us do that best. And so I think there's also in succession planning this chance to think about growth and opportunity and flexibility. I saw some stats recently that in the US, who keep great job stats, 15 million Americans have resigned from their jobs in the last 120 days. And they're calling it the Great Resignation. And I think it's a drive towards people wanting the things Swazi talked about: flexibility, opportunity, different skill sets, different exposures. And in South Africa, I don't anticipate people jumping off the job bandwagon because of the shortage of jobs out there. But the risk is that if you can't tap people for succession or help them think about their future differently, and I think that's quite a broad definition of succession, you run the risk that you end up with people who are stuck in your organization and don't want to be there or don't believe the organization believes in them.
Cool, thanks so much, Graham. Would anyone else like to sort of just add on to the risks, or can we move on to the actual approaches taken for succession? Cool, okay. So in terms of approaches to succession, Swazi, just want to come across to you now. Can you share a little bit about your current succession planning process, either current or sort of in the previous, your previous roles?
I think what's been interesting is two of the probably three big organizations I've worked for follow a similar approach, which is the one of having a ratio. And then I'll explain a bit about having ratio. So in thinking about it, it's really about looking at succession planning immediately for incidents or events that could happen in the next 0, call it to 6 months. Looking at talent in what we call the short term, so say 6 to 18 months, and then the longer term 18 months plus or 24 months plus in different organizations. Play with what the immediate short term and long term looks like, and how you get to that ratio is then thinking about immediately I would need one person for a specific role. Therefore, the first part of my ratio is that one, short term, perhaps it's easier for me to plan for two because it gives me time to prepare more than one individual, because in thinking about it, something could happen to that individual. So I'll have two. And in the longer term, I could have three. And you get a ratio of 1 to 3 or 1 to 2, depending on what your organization has a preference for. And we at Old Mutual currently use a ratio, which one allows you to be deliberate about planning long term. So it's one thing to say, in the next 5 years, my ambition is for Graham to be X. But what happens if Graham decides to leave tomorrow, or in 6 months' time wants to take a different opportunity? So it's important to think within that long-term period, what are the mitigating plans that I have for a specific role, for a specific position? And I think what it does for organizations is it forces thought around and deliberateness around planning for roles, but it also gives you a timeline that you have to commit to. Many organizations, you may have a plan for someone, but in terms of delivering and executing against that, we sometimes take a little bit longer because we, at the point in time, believe the person will stay, and maybe it's not necessary at that point in time. So I think the ratio approach certainly has worked in the two organizations, and I mean organizations that have been around for more than 170 years and are quite massive. And I think that practice has helped in planning for ships that size in the immediate short and long term. And I think from an Old Mutual perspective, we've also evolved from a linear succession planning relating to roles. So thinking about a specific job, if I'm planning for the next production manager or the next financial manager, it's a job family kind of planning, where I think historically, if you were in the finance, call it path, then succession planning would follow that. And we've embraced a more clustering methodology, which starts to talk about skills and capabilities of the future, which forces us to look outside of specific job families, outside of specific roles. Where else can we get talent from? And that starts to talk to some of the stuff that we're seeing other organizations in South Africa do around talent sharing, and are wanting to follow that. I think we're not there yet. I think the likes of Unilever and Vodacom are way ahead, who've done a talent sharing, succession planning type of approach, which I think is a bit ahead of where we are, but definitely have embraced a shift to clustering, looking at skills and skill sets and capabilities holistically, and then planning for talent within the organization and how we backfill what that looks like, versus the linear thought of, if I started, for example, in HR, I will continue in HR. I can share many stories of leaders who have come in the business, and we've looked at it from a skill and capabilities perspective. And it also, I think what it has done, it requires quite a bit of trust and vulnerability from the organization perspective to be able to trust that individual, that the skills and capabilities that you've identified, and it forces you to back that individual and back that path that you're choosing. And I think, yeah, I think that in our succession plan also helps us to stand apart, I think, from some of our competitors.
Awesome, cool. Thank you, Swazi. So, Graham, on our new normal, you know, this term that's being thrown around for the last 18, 19 months, does this have any effect on sort of succession approaches, or is it sort of just business as usual in this regard?
Yeah, I think Caitlin's probably better equipped to answer this, given that this is the space that they operate in daily. But just one comment, and I think it ties to your question and to what Swazi just shared with us, is that there's this idea that talent is, you know, or we're stuck a little bit with this idea that talent is linear. And in fact, our organization is filled with the talent often that we need, but it's been boxed or labeled in a particular way. And so breaking some of that up and thinking more about skills of the future means you have to engage learning and development, and you have to be thinking about what you're hiring for the future. It's difficult to predict the future. It's why futurists can make a great living. But I think that giving thought to how you unpack and look at the skills that are already available inside your talent market, for example, could be a helpful way to think about it. So I've given you a half answer, but I do think Caitlin's probably better positioned to give you an answer around that question.
Thanks, Graham.
Let me jump in. So thanks, Graham. I think you covered a lot of what I wanted to say as well, which is, for me, it's about looking at two perspectives. The first one being, as HR or as business leadership, how do we run succession planning in a world where we maybe can't follow the same processes we used to follow? You know, a lot of organizations still use paper and pencil assessments, for example, or assessment centers. And how do we modernize the practices that we use? How do we bring them online? How do we reach people that are in different geographical locations? And I think we've all been in a crash course of Microsoft Teams and Zoom in the past 2 years. And then the other perspective, I think, is, well, if we're going to continue working online, if this world is only going to become crazier and things are going to change more and more rapidly, what sort of individuals do we see as being the talent of the future? And that's about thinking not only about succession planning for our CEO in terms of what the CEO does now, but what will the CEO be expected to do in 5 years? And the same for your sales managers and everyone else. And so for us, that's about thinking, you know, what are the new skills? There's a lot of research on, you know, the future skills, the things that people will need to do. One way that we look at this, and we like to measure it, is by focusing on learning agility. In other words, how effective are you at being open to change and adapting to change and, yeah, coming up with new approaches to things.
Awesome, thanks, Caitlin. Linda, sort of your views on the new on the new normal or new ways of work. Obviously, with Uber, sort of the nature of your business, I can imagine you're going through quite a bit of that.
We have, we have migrated to a permanent hybrid work structure. So that's our new way of working. And we did see quite a bit of loss in our business. We did see loss of some key individuals that we, very rapidly had to find step-in solutions for. So I do think that I think it may be more challenging to try and do really meaningful development. And if you take that 70-20-10 principle of learning, where 70% of what you learn happens on the job, and it is more difficult to do that in a virtual world or a hybrid world. I don't think it's insurmountable, but there will be things that will need to be done differently in order for us to be able to do the grooming and the development that's needed. I don't have all the answers as to what those are, but that certainly is going to make it harder.
Sure, cool, thanks. And I'm going to stay with you. Look, obviously, Swazi is from a business like Old Mutual, which is I guess you could say massive. But from your perspective, slightly smaller. What are your views on how succession planning differs in organizations of different sizes? Is there a difference?
I think probably, bigger organizations always have bigger budgets and the ability to assign resources, maybe to dedicated resources to projects like this. In small organizations, it's harder. I'm sure there are a lot of people on this call who are in smaller organizations and don't have the luxury of perhaps even an HR professional running this kind of thing for them. So it's definitely very different. We've been fortunate in that we've been able to partner with HFM in order to just really understand kind of the lay of the land for our people at the moment. Kind of who do we have in inventory, or what do we have in inventory rather, in terms of skills and competence and capabilities. And we're at a very, very early stage of our succession planning journey. I'd say our process maturity is around about a 1 at the moment. So it's very early days for us. Our focus at the moment has just been to get a good understanding of who and what skills we have in the business. We've also placed quite a strong emphasis on learning agility, assessing that and really knowing what we have to work with. Our next step will be to identify our mission critical roles. We had 2 incidents in the business over the last 18 months where we lost one person to COVID and another almost left. And to just really kind of start working without the luxury of consultants and that sort of thing, to start working on a framework for succession planning, get a good sense of, as I said, who we have, what we need, what competencies are going to be necessary for the future, and then to start identifying potential candidates. But I think it is, if you don't have the luxury of a lot of resources and a lot of money, I think it's still very, very possible to do it on your own. And there are such great resources out there that can support you and guide you with very simple frameworks. So just look out for them.
Awesome, cool, thanks, Linda. Swazi, when we were having our sort of prep calls and pre-webinar chats, you touched on something very important, particularly in South Africa. So how does succession planning play out in the South African context with regards to diversity, inclusion, and transformation?
Sure, I think the South African context, and when we were talking about it, I highlighted that I think is probably a special one, and I think we tiptoe around some of these topics, and I actually see it as so much opportunity. In thinking about succession planning, it can't be, and my personal belief and philosophy I apply in our business is there's legislation that we must comply with for historic reasons, and that exists and it's there for a purpose, and by rights should be there and we should do it. I think secondary to that, I also believe if you do the right things, you get to the right mix of the business. So if you think about what the research again tells us is that organizations that are diverse and are inclusive generally perform better. If you look at the top 500 globally, and from a diversity perspective, look at their boards, at their business makeups, and the companies that do well are those that have the diversity, have a diverse force. And I think for me, in considering your succession planning, part of it has to be with the mission of building a diverse team and being able to make sure that, yes, there's a legislation piece of it, but you have all the voices necessary in a room. I think it makes such a difference by having different voices in the room. I think of many a campaign that has been run because maybe you didn't have a specific voice in the room, and that business suffers from a reputation perspective just because from a diversity perspective we hadn't planned or thought about it. And I think the same applies from a succession perspective. It's important to think about in our planning where there's a gap. And I'll make a specific example. In a previous organization I worked for, what we identified was we were struggling with a shortage of males in specific type of roles. And what it took was being deliberate. As an example, going out into the market, finding young gentlemen who were interested and were in university, and being quite deliberate about those individuals and their development to make sure that we have the right voices in the room. And it took us time. And you would argue that that's a lot of time and a lot of investment. But I think from an outcome perspective, we certainly achieved what we needed to from a mixed perspective, and it just brought a different dynamic to that team. So in terms of thinking about it, it's not always going to be easy, it's going to be tough. And it sometimes means going to find someone in university, going to find someone in a different industry, finding someone who shows even slight potential and has that interest, and working with that individual deliberately and getting them into that space so that you have the right mix. I think naturally the rest of the things follow from a legislation perspective and what needs to be done, but having the right mix from an innovation perspective, having the right voices in the room, decision-making, how you problem solve, how you think about anything. I can tell you, all of us on this panel, you've asked us, some of us, the same questions, and the angle with which we're coming at it is completely different. And I mean, I'm hearing things Graham is saying like, oh yeah, that's a thought for me. So that diversity translates into business value when applied to succession planning. So, and you can hear I'm very passionate about getting the mix of organizations right, because I think it really goes a long way in terms of just making those businesses successful. And from an innovation perspective, you stand yourself apart from your competitor.
Nick, can I ask a question of Swazi?
Go for it.
And Linda. One of the things I've experienced on arrival inside organizations, and for my sins, I was also an HR professional for 10 years in professional services, is that the courage to have these conversations about things like diversity, change, talent, shape, size, age, demographic is held often behind closed doors with only a few. And it often means that the succession conversation is stuck in a room rather than being something that everybody in the organization feels a part of. How have you both navigated this? Because there's a sensitivity to these conversations which you really have to be careful with. Some people are simply not going to move through the ranks or take up leadership roles. So how have you dealt with this hot potato, which sometimes only lives behind closed doors, and how do you make it part of a broader talent management, performance, agility, innovation conversation?
Swazi, can I ask you to answer that, because I'm still so new in my journey here?
Okay, I can go for it. So Graham, I think part of the challenge is that this hot potato is happening behind closed doors. And in having the hot potato behind closed doors, you open up so much for a narrative around what's happening in that room and what voices being heard and what conversations are taking place. So definitely an advocate for transparency. And I know that you could argue that, but how am I transparent around some of these things? I think the organization needs to be brave and come out with a stance. In an organization where I worked for, the challenge wasn't race as we typically think in South Africa, it was age. working for an organization where there's a number of people, a large part of the organization was over the age of 50. And somehow, I think a stance from the organization that says, we want to be sustainable into the future. And part of that means that we're going to have to absolutely be deliberate about our recruitment approach, about our replacement approach. And also, by the way, we're not saying that if you're over 50, there's no place for you. There's absolutely a place for you because you have the knowledge, because you are so experienced, because there's so many other talents that you bring. And I think it's important to be transparent on your stance, making sure you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, and be clear on there is a place for you and this is what it therefore means. It's not a us and the them. It's about building an organization that is sustainable into a future. And it does mean that you are going to have the right mix. And mix, yes, talks to race, but it also talks to gender, it talks to age, it talks to religion, it talks to so many things. And I think bringing that transparency from behind the door to people so that we know so that someone knows where they stand, right? And also what you do is give respect to individuals in the organization, because then they can make a choice. If I know that at this point in time, this organization has this talent strategy going forward and it's for the sustainability of the business, you've given me the respect and the information for me to make a choice for myself that, Graham, love your organization, but I know that long-term, this is not where probably in the next 10 years, it might not work. What it therefore means, how do I help you? And you start to contract. How do I help you transfer the knowledge in the last 5 years that I have with you? And we handshake and walk away in an amicable way. Everybody gets what they need. I think critical to some of these succession conversations is the transparency, because once you take that away, you open room for narratives, hot potatoes, version control, and all the other things that come with it. So definitely would advocate for transparency, have a stance as an organization, and communicate it.
Yeah. Sorry for the hard question.
This is what
I think. I was just going to say, I think that the thing about transparency is it can only happen if the organization has a good data set that it can understand what it's got and what it's aiming for. And without that, I always felt like the conversations were happening in secret because nobody really knew what was on their plate or what their organization looked like.
Yeah. Graham, we took an approach that was quite it was informed by customer data in terms of succession planning intervention that we're running at the moment. We've actually established a sort of a sales talent development academy, and we're only taking on board young African interns. And the data was very transparent. Our client profile and first home buyer profile is very different from our organizational demographic. So we have to make some radical shifts and very intentional shifts in the demographic of our business. So the data was there and it was very transparent. And when you match that up with the demographic of the organization, there was a big fat gap that we needed to deal with. So it wasn't a difficult conversation. You know, I would say data creates insights and insight drive change. So that was the approach we took.
Cool, thanks. Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Swazi. Thanks, Graham. We will move on now to sort of the more practical side of things. So I'm going to put up a very quick poll, and then we're going to cross over to Caitlin, who is going to share with us some of the best practices for succession planning. So while she's getting ready for that, I just need to put up the second poll, which is: what barriers to succession planning do you experience in your organization? It is multiple choice, so select a couple. Is it budget? Is it buy-in from the top? Is it you're lacking a defined process, lacking knowledge, lacking time, or are there currently no barriers? So just give that a couple of seconds. In the meantime, Caitlin, you can get your stuff up. And yeah, I will end this in a few seconds. Oh, still shooting up. Awesome to see such great participation from you guys, which is fantastic. Cool. I'm just going to end the poll as we hand over to Caitlin. So currently we're sitting 35% say budget is an issue, buy-in is an issue. Defined process, there we go. That seems to be the overriding concern. Also lack of knowledge, lack of time, and a whole 9 people say there are no barriers to succession planning. So that's quite interesting. Yeah, cool. Thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you, Nick. Very interesting results. And hopefully some of these best practices and ideas to consider that I'm going to talk through now can help with that defined process. Although I also believe we think that there's an ideal right answer out there. And I think every organization is different. And ultimately, it's about finding what works best for your organization. Right. So before we get into some ideas to consider, I wanted to share a very simple framework of succession planning. And this looks at it in terms of 3 phases. The first one being determine your focus. When you're setting out for succession planning, whether you have an existing process that you want to improve upon, or whether you're starting from scratch, it's quite important to understand what you want to do, why you want to do it, so the goals that are driving your planning process, and how you want to set out to complete it. The second step would then be identifying your talent. In other words, understanding more about who your talent is, where they are in the organization, and using that as the data to then help you move into the third stage, which is building your talent pipeline. In other words, bringing all of this data together into some sort of view or perspective that you can use to shortlist successes and start development journeys. And you'll see from our model that we see succession planning as being very, very closely linked to development. So in an ideal world, I think the 2 should continually feed into one another and work to improve one another. So let's look at the first phase, which is determining your focus. But before we get into some ideas, I wanted to share one of the key outcomes from a survey we ran recently. So we asked South African business leaders in South Africa, we've asked them, what are your perspectives on succession planning? What do you know about succession planning? And how do you do it? And what sort of value do you see? And we saw a very interesting gap. So most of the respondents, a very high percentage, said that succession planning is critical for the success of organizations. But when we asked them, well, how do you actually do succession planning? What approaches do you take? Only 19% indicated that they take a structured, consistent approach to succession, which we found very interesting, which means 81% are either not doing it all in their organizations, or they're taking more of a reactive or ad hoc approach. And I think this underscores the importance of, first thinking about and considering your plan. So some best practices that we have seen in practice, the first one being that succession planning should not really be owned solely by HR. In an ideal world, I think it should really be owned and championed by the leaders and by the executives in the organization. And then the role of HR would be to provide the tools and the process which is easy to follow, which is fair to the participants, and which is consistent. And I think if you are HR or if you are a leader who wants to start succession planning in your business, one way to try and get that buy-in is to speak to the leaders, learn from them, understand what their talent needs are, and design your succession planning to help address some of those needs. Right, then when we talk about succession planning, it can be this huge process, very detailed, or you could start on a smaller basis. And a good way to do that is to start with the roles that are the most critical. In other words, if they were left vacant, it would greatly impact upon the business. Or perhaps these are roles which require very scarce skills or a very scarce profile of employee. So there's actually a number of questions you can ask to determine if a role is critical, and we'll happily share those with the audience in our post-webinar communication together with the slides. And then lastly, once you have your critical roles, for us, it's important to consciously think about what determines success in those roles. What does success look like? I think a lot of the time we have things like job profiles and we have information about the roles, But it's important to spend time actually reflecting on that, thinking about the technical and soft skills that are needed now. What do we need 3 years down the line, 5 years down the line? Because that ultimately informs what you will then look for in your talent, to fill this role in future. Right, so the second phase is all about identifying or understanding the talent in your organization. Before we get into the best practices, I just wanted to share another outcome from the survey. So we asked those organizations that take a structured and consistent approach, that 19% I spoke about earlier. We asked them, well, how do you approach your decision-making in your succession planning? What can we learn from you in terms of the approach you take? And very interestingly, they noted that they take a balanced approach when they look for talent and when they make talent decisions in succession planning. And they balance subjective sources of information, which are those human perspectives, those deeper insights, for example, manager ratings, manager opinions, with more objective information, things like psychometric assessments, things like KPIs, and it's the balance of both that really help them to get the true value of the information. So when we deal with clients at HFMtalentindex, from people who've never done succession planning all the way through to people who just want to augment a very sophisticated process, the first step that we take is usually to think about what metrics the company already has, which can be used in succession planning. And one of the most common areas to start, and a very important part of succession planning, is to understand and capture current performance in the role. In other words, understanding what are my employees doing currently, how are they doing, and what are they doing well. Then building upon that, we do advocate to objectively measure potential and agility. So the research shows, and our practical experience also shows, that past experience doesn't actually always predict future performance. In other words, if you're doing well as a salesperson, you're not necessarily going to be a great sales manager. And so measuring potential is all about understanding the future perspective. So it brings a lot of objectivity and fairness to the process, and it helps you to understand, are there any areas of latent talent? Are there any things that this person could perhaps develop in future? And what is the future perspective for this individual? And then lastly, we've spoken about very numerical data, but as Graham referred to earlier, the human perspective is a critical part of succession and capturing more detail. What's important in our process, and what I think is a good lesson to keep in mind, is the value of feedback is not reduced by making it structured. In other words, if you have a consistent way to gather, to record, and to integrate these qualitative insights, it actually adds value to your process because it streamlines it and it makes it easier for your managers and your executives at the end of the day to integrate that together and to use that to make decisions. Then the third step, building your talent pipeline, bringing all of your data together to actually put it in a view that you can use to make decisions. In our survey, we also asked organizations, well, why do you do succession planning? What are you hoping to get out of it at the end of the day? And the number one reason that organizations shared is to ensure business continuity, what Swazi spoke about earlier. Another reason is, organizations really see the need to structurally identify future talent and future leaders, very importantly, to create career paths together with employees, and to set the direction for development in the future. And some other things that were mentioned as well are things like preparing for change and improving the diversity of the leadership teams. So now that you're at the stage where you need to take all of your talent insights and put it together, we tend to talk about a talent pipeline or a pipeline perspective. And this is an ideal world situation or a long-term situation. But we find succession works best and is very well integrated with development, where, like I said, there's a pipeline perspective. In other words, every employee has a place somewhere in your pipeline and has a development journey that they are going on with their line manager and with the organization that is aligned to their career path and that's aligned to their potential. And that means you really have, like I said, everyone is involved to some extent, and you have enough flexibility that if there's a newly created position, for example, that can be filled from your talent pipeline, or you could replace a role that has just been vacated by someone who has, been promoted. And I think when we're talking about a pipeline, we need to keep in mind that realistically, there are some people who don't have a promotion path in the organization or who don't have the ambition to move to another role. And in those cases, I think it's important to consider, well, how do we engage those individuals in maybe a different way or develop them in their current role? Then the next idea to consider is to balance the short term and the long term. And Swazi spoke about this very eloquently earlier in terms of, succession planning usually being quite a long-term perspective. Development takes time. These things do take time. Usually a 3 to 5 year horizon for a lot of roles. But it's also important to have some sort of emergency plan or crisis plan if something unexpected happens in the next, say, 6 months to 1 year. And that could even be something like asking senior managers to take on extra responsibilities, as an example. And then lastly, make data available for decision making. We included this one because we've worked with a few organizations in the past who have done every single step that I've discussed, and they've gotten stuck at this last part of the process. Because if you gather a lot of information, it can become very overwhelming. You could have all of your qualitative perspectives, you could have all of these numbers, but how do you bring it together? How do you make a decision? And how do you know what to do next? And we find the biggest success is if you streamline it a little bit, so you don't lose detail, but you create a structured perspective or framework with all of the information. And that really does allow, the decision makers to get an overview of what's important and then, use it to make decisions. So here's an example of a framework which is very popular. We use this extensively. Many organizations use this. The Ninebox matrix. I think it'll be familiar to a lot of the individuals in the audience. But for those who are maybe not as familiar, the purpose of this is really to get a visual perspective of the talent in your organization. So you would then plot people in each of these 9 blocks based on their potential for roles and also based on their performance in their current position. So what we find in practice is organizations that use the Ninebox. Performance is a very easy question to answer. It's usually measured, there's usually metrics available, and it's quite easy to plot. But organizations tend to struggle a little bit more with the potential side of the matrix. Not everyone does structured assessments, and so there's often a question of, well, how do we plot this? Where do we get this information from? And from our perspective, it speaks to what I said earlier. For us, the real value of this potential is to bring in an objective measure, a future perspective, based on, psychometrics, for example, personality, agility, and so on. But that's it from me. Thank you all for your attention, for listening. And I think, Nick, we're going to jump to the questions and answers from the audience.
Yes, cool. Thanks so much, Caitlin. Very, very informative. It's amazing how quickly these things go. We've got 7 minutes left, and there have been some amazing questions, both in this session as well as in some of the pre-registration questions. There is one I do need to direct, please, to Graham, which came in during the registration process, and really quite an important thing to discuss. So Graham, what messaging should be sent to the business about succession plans so as not to create expectations? And how can feelings of disappointment be mitigated for candidates who were groomed for succession, but were unsuccessful?
Oh. It's tough. I think if there was an answer to that question, then we wouldn't have all these HR people logged on to listen to this conversation. I think transparency is a cultural thing, Nick, and it comes from the top. And I think the way in which leaders deal with people who are promoted and people who are not promoted or who don't have their aspirations met in the workplace is about having those honest conversations. So I think that if succession doesn't live in the boardroom at the executive level, if it isn't part of the conversations, if people, talent, and culture aren't constantly being dissected and rearranged and looked at the exco level, it can be very difficult to try to have that transparency all the way down. And I often feel that HR managers are lumped with some of this responsibility. Hey, go and tell Graham he didn't cut it. He's not getting that job. So I don't have a great answer. I think it's about building transparent cultures. I saw Linda responded to somebody on the chat in the chat room about trying to get transparency at every level. I think it's also about recognizing that succession conversations probably only happen in mid to senior levels and not below that. Otherwise, you do open yourself up to a host of conversations and challenges that you might not be able to deal with. And then the last one about disappointment is probably thinking about why people believe that if it's not this job, then there's nothing for them. Does your organization have enough opportunity? Are you rethinking or repurposing people? Are you giving them chance to learn new skills? In one of our HR Indaba conversations, Google had a fascinating response to a project where they gave everybody 6 weeks of carers leave for the COVID crisis. And in that time, they ran a project called the 20% Project. And the 20% Project allowed you to put your hand up to do 20% of somebody's job who was taking some of that leave. And what it unearthed was a great deal of talent within the organization who could take on new roles, join different departments, get involved in things, and by putting up their hand, expose themselves as talented, but also gave them a chance to test or try new things without quitting their job. So I'm sorry that it isn't a clear answer, but my sense is that transparency lives at the top, and that it's about figuring out how to have those conversations and almost rethink whether your practices of job development and job change are up to scratch or need a little bit of work.
Awesome, cool, thanks Graham. We are almost out of time, but I would like to sort of ask, start with Swazi. If the guys can leave here with just one piece of advice in terms of starting out on this journey, what would it be from you?
I think one of the panelists alluded to it, understanding your lay of the land. And I think, Linda, you also spoke a bit about it. Understanding what talent you currently have and being able to tell the story of talent the same way you would your strategy, by the way, of where you want to be in the future. So for me, understanding the talent you have, and once you start to look against where you want to be in the future, you will quickly start to identify what are the quick wins, what are the long-term things you need to do to get you there. We're very able to tell you where our businesses will be in the next 5, 10, 15 years. Companies normally have visions and missions that we articulate and strategies that we're very proud of. The same needs to happen for your talent story because it needs to mirror that. So having a conversation that talks to, this is understand where you are today and understand your data. And I know some different organizations in different places on where their data is, but you need to start collecting that, even if it's on a spreadsheet, and trying to cut and chop that data to be able to tell your today's story so that you can plan and prepare for your future story linked to your strategy, because that strategy is not going to happen in the absence of those enablers on that journey with you. So for me, it's understanding your talent today, tell the story that what you do for your strategy, mirror in your people strategy and your succession planning.
Awesome, thank you. As Caitlin, one last bit of advice from you.
Yes, thank you. In my mind, succession planning is only as successful as the needs that it solves, right, for the organization and for individuals. And so I would say keep that in mind. when you're designing, when you're thinking about your process, if you're improving upon your process, what needs do we want to set out to solve, and how are we going to go about that?
Cool, thank you so much. And just like that, the time is over. We've got so many questions and comments still to get through that we really could go on for another hour, but we do need to be cognizant of everyone's time. Please just be aware, any questions that we haven't answered, we will make sure that they are answered in the coming days, mostly by Caitlin and the HFM team. So just in closing, thank you so much everyone for joining. Thank you to our panelists, to Caitlin, to Linda, to Swazi, and to Graham. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been absolutely fantastic. If you guys want to check out the rest of the webinars coming up, both for the rest of this year and starting into 2022, please check out chro.co.za/events, and you can see what we've got coming up. But yeah, thanks guys, have a wonderful day. And again, thanks to everyone for joining. Cheerio.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, guys. Have a good day.
Thanks, Aid. Ciao, ciao.